The roar of motorcycles shattered the quiet harmony of Clarksville as a gang of leather-clad bikers stormed onto the street. Their leader, Rick, strutted into the yard of a quiet, elderly veteran and ripped down the American flag that stood as a proud symbol of his service. He tossed it onto the ground, grinding it under his boot with a sneer. "Your time's over, old man," Rick spat, his voice dripping with mockery. "Why don't you just fade away?" Neighbors watched helplessly from behind their curtains, too afraid to intervene as the bikers trampled flower beds, sprayed graffiti on a memorial, and hurled insults at the stoic man who stood silently, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. Rick's crew laughed, reveling in their unchecked power. But what Rick didn't realize, what none of them could have known, was that the man they were humiliating had a past as formidable as it was unassuming. Beneath the quiet demeanor lay a lifetime of strength, honor, and connections that could bring the chaos to a screeching halt. When the truth finally came out, it wasn't the veteran who would be left shaken. It was the bikers. What followed would become the talk of the town, a story of justice served with quiet dignity and unexpected power. But let's start at the beginning. Raymond Ray Henderson was a man of routine. Every morning began with a cup of tea, which he enjoyed on the porch of his meticulously maintained home in Clarksville. The house, framed by neatly trimmed hedges and adorned with an American flag, was a testament to its owner's values: dedication, order, and respect for the past. In the yard stood a modest memorial, a stone engraved with the names of his fallen comrades, a quiet tribute to the bonds forged in service. To the neighborhood, he was simply Mr. Henderson, the kind-hearted elderly neighbor who always had a friendly smile and wise advice. But this day would be different. The quiet of the afternoon was shattered by the roar of motorcycle engines. A group of bikers, clad in leather jackets bearing the emblem of the Hell Wolves, stormed onto his street like a scene straight out of a rebellious outlaw movie. Leading the pack was Rick, a burly man with a smug grin that screamed trouble. As the gang pulled up near Ray's house, their engines rumbling like a storm, Rick caught sight of the elderly man tending to his garden. With a smirk, he nudged one of his companions and pointed. "Look at this guy," Rick drawled, loud enough for Ray to hear. "Living in the past with his shiny metals and fancy little garden. Hey, old man, don't you think it's time you retired permanently?" The gang erupted into laughter, their jeers echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Rick dismounted his bike and strolled toward the yard, his boots crunching against the gravel. With an exaggerated show of disdain, he flicked a cigarette butt onto the pristine lawn. Ray, still crouched by his flowers, looked up slowly. His face was calm, but there was a glint in his eyes. The kind of sharpness that only years of experience could forge. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Ray said evenly, standing and dusting off his hands. "I don't suppose you're here to admire the roses?" Rick snorted, stepping closer. "Roses? Nah, we're more into redecorating." He gestured to one of his lackeys, who kicked over a small wooden flagpole bearing an American flag. The flag tumbled to the ground, a move that drew an audible gasp from a couple of neighbors peeking out from their windows. Ray's gaze shifted to the fallen flag. His expression didn't change, but his silence spoke volumes. "That's a shame," he finally said. "Took me a while to get that just right." Rick wasn't finished. He grabbed the hem of Ray's jacket, inspecting the row of neatly polished medals pinned there. "What's this? Some kind of costume? You think these make you important, Grandpa?" Ray met his gaze, unflinching. "They're not for show, son, but I'll ask you politely to let go." Rick sneered, but released the jacket, turning back to his gang with a loud laugh. "This guy, polite as a Sunday sermon. What are you gonna do, pray us away?" The group howled, tossing empty soda cans and scraps of trash onto Ray's yard. One of them revved his engine, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over the lawn. Ray's voice, calm but firm, cut through the noise. "I'll ask you all once to leave. This isn't the place for what you're doing." Rick turned back to him, eyes glinting with mockery. "Oh, we'll leave for now, but don't get too comfortable, old-timer. We'll be back to see how you're holding up. Maybe we'll even bring you a rocking chair." With that, the gang roared off, leaving a trail of laughter and debris in their wake. Ray stood motionless for a moment, then bent down to retrieve the fallen flag, brushing off the dust with care. He adjusted it on its pole and returned it to its rightful place. From a window, one of the neighbors, a young mother clutching her toddler, whispered to her husband, "Should we call someone? He looks so alone out there. Ray, however, didn't seem the least bit rattled. As he stood back to admire the restored flag, he muttered under his breath with a faint smile, "Alone? Not quite. They'll learn that soon enough." The following day, the neighborhood once again echoed with the deafening rumble of motorcycle engines. The hell wolves roared down Ray's quiet street like an uninvited storm. Rick, with his ever-present smirk, led the way. The gang parked in front of Ray's house, the screech of their tires leaving fresh marks on the road. Ray was outside, tending to his garden, his hands steady as he pruned a rosebush. He didn't look up immediately. His calm demeanor only seemed to fuel the gang's need for chaos. "Back at it, Grandpa," Rick shouted, dismounting his bike. He marched up to Ray, grabbing the pruning shears out of his hands. "You know, these flowers could use a little creative touch." With a dramatic flourish, Rick dropped the shears and kicked over the small flagpole. The American flag fell to the ground. Gasps escaped from the windows of nearby houses where neighbors watched, too fearful to intervene. Ray straightened up, his calm gaze fixed on Rick. "You should pick that up," he said, his tone even but firm. Rick ignored him, turning to his gang with a mock expression of shock. "Did you hear that? Grandpa thinks he's in charge." His companions howled with laughter, one of them stepping onto the flagpole and snapping it in two. But they weren't done. Rick gestured toward the small memorial in the yard. "What's this, some kind of rock collection?" Without waiting for an answer, he pulled a can of neon green spray paint from his jacket and shook it loudly. "Let's add some flair to this place," he announced, spraying the memorial with haphazard zigzags and an illegible scrawl of letters. Ray's grip tightened on the edge of his gardening gloves, but he didn't say a word. His silence was met with more laughter as one of the bikers began filming the scene on his phone. "Smile for the camera, old man," the biker jeered, pointing the phone at Ray. "Let's make you famous." Rick, emboldened, grabbed Ray by the collar of his jacket, pulling him close. "What are you gonna do about it, huh? Hit me with your cane? Tell me another story about the good old days?" His sneer was inches from Ray's face, but Ray's gaze didn't waver. His voice, steady as ever, carried an edge that silenced even the boldest of the gang. "Your actions have consequences," he said, "and you'll find that out soon enough." For a moment, Rick faltered. There was something unsettling in Ray's tone, something that hinted at a depth Rick hadn't anticipated. But the gang leader quickly shook it off, plastering his smirk back on. "Oh, we'll find out, all right," Rick crowed, stepping back. "Let's see how many views this gets online. Grandpa versus the Wolves. Sounds like a hit, doesn't it?" The group erupted into another round of laughter, but there was an edge of nervousness in the air now. Rick, trying to keep the upper hand, waved his gang toward their bikes. "Let's roll," he said, tossing the empty spray can onto the lawn. "We've got better things to do than babysit." As the roar of their engines faded into the distance, Ray stood alone in his yard. The neighbors, peeking from their windows, exchanged uneasy glances. They couldn't understand why Ray didn't fight back or call the authorities. Ray bent down to pick up the fallen flag, brushing it off with careful hands. He glanced at the vandalized memorial, his expression unreadable. Turning to the broken flagpole, he set it aside with a sigh, then looked toward the horizon where the bikers had disappeared. "Not long now," he murmured, a faint smile playing on his lips. Then, as if nothing had happened, he returned to his rose bush, trimming away the damaged petals with deliberate care. From her window, a young woman whispered to her husband, "He doesn't even seem angry. What do you think he's going to do?" Her husband, watching the scene with a furrowed brow, replied, "I don't know, but I wouldn't want to be in those biker's shoes when he does." The third day began like any other in the quiet neighborhood of Clarksville, but it didn't take long for the tranquility to be shattered. The Hell Wolves arrived in full force, revving their engines louder than ever. This time, they weren't just here to intimidate. They were determined to leave their mark. Rick dismounted his bike with an air of exaggerated confidence, cracking his knuckles as he surveyed Ray's yard. "All right, boys," he announced. "Let's show the old man what happens when you mess with the wolves." The gang erupted into laughter as two of them headed straight for the fence, yanking at the wooden slats with unnecessary aggression. Another biker grabbed a sledgehammer from his bike, theatrically spinning it before slamming it into the base of a garden trellis. Pieces of wood scattered across the yard. Ray stood on his porch, calm as ever, watching the chaos unfold. His hands were clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. Rick caught sight of him and sneered. "What's the matter, old-timer? Finally figured out you can't win? Or are you just hoping the gardening club shows up to save you?" Ray didn't respond, which only fueled Rick's bravado. "Come on, Grandpa, give us something. Yell, scream, do anything." He turned to his crew. "Maybe we'll leave him a couple of roses as a souvenir." Just as the bikers began tearing down another section of the fence, the low hum of engines grew louder in the distance. It wasn't the harsh rumble of motorcycles this time, but the unmistakable sound of powerful engines. The bikers paused, turning toward the sound. 3 black SUVs rolled up the street, their windows tinted and their movements precise. They parked in perfect alignment, the kind of precision that hinted at something far more serious than a casual visit. The doors opened in unison. From each vehicle stepped men in sharp suits and military attire, their presence commanding immediate attention. The neighborhood, once filled with laughter and jeers, fell into an almost eerie silence. Rick, ever the showman, didn't miss a beat. "What's this?" he called out, gesturing dramatically. "The Grandpa fan club? Did you call in the cavalry, old man?" One of the men stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with a quiet authority. His silver hair caught the sunlight as he adjusted his tie and walked straight up to Rick. Without a word, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather-bound ID. "Colonel Raymond Henderson," he announced, his voice firm and steady. "Former commander of special operations. You just crossed the line, son." Rick froze, his smirk faltering. He opened his mouth to retort but found himself unable to speak. The rest of the gang exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado quickly evaporating. But the surprises weren't over. From the SUVs emerged several more individuals, each one radiating the same air of quiet strength. Some were in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes, but their disciplined movements and sharp gazes left no doubt about their backgrounds. One of them, a towering man with an intimidating presence, stepped forward. He fixed Rick with a glare so intense it seemed to pin him in place. "This man, and his home," the newcomer said, gesturing to Ray, "are family. You mess with him, you mess with all of us." The bikers, once so cocky, now looked like cornered animals. Rick tried to muster some semblance of defiance. "We didn't mean any harm, just having a little fun," he stammered, his voice lacking its usual confidence. The towering man took a deliberate step closer, pulling out his phone. "Fun, huh? Let's see how fun it is when the world watches this." With that, the group of veterans and soldiers began filming the scene. They recorded the damage, the paint on the memorial, the broken fence, and the gang's nervous faces. Rick's usual swagger was gone, replaced by a pale, sheepish expression. One of the veterans turned to Ray, offering a respectful nod. "Permission to handle this, Colonel?" Ray, still calm, stepped forward, his voice carrying just enough steel to silence any further protest from the bikers. "Let them fix what they've broken," he said, "then they can leave. And if I ever see them here again, we won't stop at a warning." The bikers scrambled to comply, picking up broken pieces of the fence and scrubbing at the paint on the memorial. The neighbors, emboldened by the sight of Ray's allies, began stepping out of their homes, some with their phones aimed at the unfolding scene. As the bikers worked, Ray stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Rick, still pale and fumbling, muttered under his breath, "This was supposed to be an easy job." Ray overheard him and leaned in just slightly. "Life has a funny way of teaching lessons," he said with a wink. By the time the SUVs drove away and the bikers fled in disgrace, the street was filled with murmurs of admiration. One of the neighbors, a young boy holding his father's hand, whispered, "Mr. Henderson is so cool." Ray chuckled softly, adjusting the collar of his jacket. "Just another day in the neighborhood," he said, turning back to his porch with a satisfied air. The once intimidating hellwolves were now reduced to a group of sheepish men, awkwardly picking up broken fence posts and scrubbing neon green paint off the memorial. The scene in Ray's yard had transformed from chaos to something almost comically mundane, with the bikers muttering half-hearted apologies as they worked under the stern gazes of Ray's veteran friends. Rick, the once smirking leader, stood by the memorial, wiping at the paint with a rag that seemed to do more smearing than cleaning. His bravado had been replaced with visible discomfort as neighbors gathered along the sidewalk, phones raised to capture every moment. The occasional flash of a camera punctuated the murmurs of the onlookers. "Move it, Rick," barked one of the veterans, a towering man with a no-nonsense demeanor. "That paint's not coming off by magic." Rick grumbled something under his breath, but redoubled his efforts, scrubbing with renewed vigor. One of the other bikers, clearly less accustomed to manual labor, struggled to hold a fence post steady as another hammered it back into place. The hammer slipped, nearly hitting his thumb. "Careful," Ray called out from his porch, sipping a glass of iced tea. His tone was calm, almost amused. "You don't want to add injuries to the list of lessons learned today." The crowd chuckled, and even a few bikers exchanged embarrassed glances. As the final touches were made, Rick shuffled over to Ray, his eyes fixed firmly on the ground. His usual swagger was completely gone, replaced by the unmistakable look of someone who knew he had stepped far out of line. He cleared his throat awkwardly and finally spoke. "Sir," Rick began, his voice barely audible. "We're sorry. We didn't know." Ray set his glass down on the porch railing and stood. He stepped forward, his steady gaze locking on Rick's. The neighborhood fell silent, the weight of the moment palpable. "Don't apologize to me," Ray said firmly. His voice carried just enough steel to make every word hit home. "Apologize to the country, to the people who fought for the freedom you just disrespected." Rick nodded quickly, stumbling over his words. "Yes, sir, we're sorry. To everyone." One of the neighbors couldn't hold back a slow clap, and soon the entire street erupted into applause. Phones captured the moment as Rick and his crew stood awkwardly, clearly wishing the earth would swallow them whole. The bikers finished their work under the watchful eyes of Ray's veteran friends, who exchanged occasional knowing glances and quiet chuckles. As the bikers climbed onto their motorcycles to leave, Ray gave them one final nod. "Remember this day," he said simply. "It'll serve you well." Rick nodded, and with engines rumbling far less arrogantly than before, the Hell Wolves rode off into the distance, their tails figuratively between their legs. As the crowd dispersed, Ray's friends gathered on the porch. One of the veterans, a tall man with a deep laugh, clapped Ray on the shoulder. "Well, Colonel, you've still got it," he said with a grin, "turning a band of hooligans into handy helpers in record time." Ray smirked, picking up his tea again. "It was an interesting way to spend the weekend," he admitted, his tone light. "Thanks for dropping by." Another veteran leaned against the railing, a playful twinkle in his eye. "You're still keeping us in shape, sir," he said with a chuckle. "Careful, or we'll start charging you for training sessions." Ray laughed, a genuine and hearty sound that echoed down the street. The sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the restored yard and the small group of friends who had once again shown that justice, dignity, and a bit of humor could go a long way.